Welcome to Never Again is Now, a podcast about anti Semitism. I am Evelyn Marcus.
And I am Phyllis Zimbler Miller.
Lessons from history can be especially useful when dealing with similar current issues. Today we're going to look back to 1902, to the largest anti Semitic riot in the United States. We'll be discussing how the Jewish community came together then and how we can do so now. Our guest today is Scott Seligman, author of the new book, The Chief Rabbi's Funeral, The Untold Story of America's Largest Anti-Semitic Riot. Scott, it's great to have you on. Welcome.
Love to be here.
What happened on the Lower East Side of New York City on July 30, 1902?
July 30 of 1902 was the setting for the largest funeral that the Lower East Side of New York had ever seen. And the person who had died was a man by the name of Jacob Joseph, or Yaakov Yosef. He was, to some people, the chief rabbi of New York. Rabbi Yosef had come to New York in 1888 at the invitation of about a couple of dozen Orthodox Russian or Eastern European congregations on the Lower East Side, who were concerned about really three things. One was the kosher meat industry, which was a mess and actually quite corrupt. And people had begun to suspect that the meat they were buying as kosher, in fact, was not kosher. So he was brought over essentially to bring some order to this chaotic industry and make sure that people could have more confidence that what they were buying was what they thought they were buying. That was the principal reason. There were two others. He was asked to oversee a Beis Din, or a Beit Din, which is a religious court, so he could adjudicate problems among the Jewish community, and specifically religious problems. And the third thing he was asked to do was to pay attention to the education of Jewish youth. A lot of the American-born children of the immigrant generation had very little knowledge, really, of Jewish law, Jewish history. They were going to American schools. They weren't in cheder, in Jewish schools. And there was a concern that they were straying from Judaism. Certainly, they're straying from Orthodox Judaism. Some were enticed by simply the secular side of life in America. Others were finding the Reform Jewish tradition attractive, and that was alarm bells for the Orthodox. So those were his three jobs. He has signed a 6-year contract. It was not renewed in the early 1990s because he really was not much of a success. He was a wonderful man. He was a kind man. He was a learned man. In Europe, they called him Yankel Haref, Jacob the Sharp, because he was such an intellectual. But he didn't speak English. He didn't understand America. And the model that they had hoped would be reproduced in America, the one of the chief rabbi of the community, which in Europe very often had the support of the government, didn't work in America. The government didn't support any particular religion or any particular religious leader. It was a matter of decision whether the synagogues wanted to affiliate with him, and not very many did. So he was not a tremendous success. There was pushback on his efforts in the meat area, and as far as the education of students were concerned, the children found him out of date and not very easy to understand. So by the middle of the 1890s, he was essentially reduced to the rank of just a mashgiach, a supervisor of the slaughterers. And then he had a series of strokes and really no longer was of much use to the community or even remembered by a lot of people in the community. And in 1902, 2 days before you asked me what July 30th, on July 28th, he finally died. And what happened after that was actually quite remarkable. It was as if the Jewish community, having essentially not paid much attention to him for almost a decade or so, they came together to give him the honor in death that they had actually denied him in life. And as soon as his death was announced, People flocked onto Henry Street where his house was, tried to get in to pay their respects. Eventually, they had to just leave people out in the street. There were just too many of them. And the question came up about how he was going to be buried and where he was going to be buried. And he had not left specific instructions as to where he wanted to be buried. So it took a couple of days before all of this could be ironed out. Number one, there was no synagogue, even his home synagogue of the Beis HaMidrash HaGadol, the largest Russian synagogue on the Lower East Side. There was no way even it could accommodate the number of people who would have wanted to attend a funeral. So they borrowed something that had been done in Europe a few times, where instead of a formal funeral, they would parade the procession that carried his body through the streets of the Lower East Side of New York, stopping at the porticos of a half a dozen synagogues that had been under his care for brief eulogies and for prayers. And then the plan was he would proceed down Grand Street to the ferry terminal. They would sail to Brooklyn and continue on to where the cemetery was. So that was the first logistical issue. And then the second one was who got to bury him. And there was a bidding war among the synagogues. The Beis HaMidrash HaGadol won because they were willing to give his wife a sizable pension after he was gone. So they decided that he was going to go there. Also, they waited an extra day because they wanted rabbis and important Jewish people from other towns and other cities to be able to come in and participate in the funeral. So all of this happened in the day or so after he died, and on July 30th was the funeral procession. What happened was, it started out fine. Lots of people, not very many police. Nobody expected it to be a real problem. And it wasn't a real problem until they passed one particular intersection on Grand Street where a large factory loomed over the intersection. It was called the Arho and Company factory. And they made printing presses. It was a very important company, actually. They were involved in lots of technological innovations in the printing industry that actually made newspapers available. Made them cheap and more available to people in the United States. But their workforce was, I don't know if it's predominantly, but a sizable number of people who worked there were immigrants. And they had an apprenticeship program that they were very proud of, where they took kids from the community, sent them to school, taught them printing technology. And then if they did well, they were hired and they were given jobs in the factory. And so as the procession, and one other thing before I tell you that, the factory had a bad reputation among the Jews. First of all, there were not a lot of Jews that were hired there. A lot of them were Germans, actually. Some of these kids were hyperactive, and if they were on their lunch hour and a Jewish guy passed on his way to worship, they'd pull the beard. Or they would throw apple cores or banana peels at the passing Jews who were on their way to shul. So it had a bad reputation among the Jewish community. But nobody really thought that anything untoward was going to happen on a day when the streets are filled with mourners. And so you have to picture this. In front of the factory at that intersection, people are jam-packed. First, there are the thousands of people who are in the procession. There's several hundred cars carrying luminaries. They're preceded by several hundred yeshiva buchers, Hebrew school students singing psalms, and followed by lots of people from his congregations who are on foot. And then there were people on the front stoops, on the roofs, on the fire escapes, not all Jews, some curious Gentiles watching the procession. So it was a huge number of people in this intersection. And when the hearse passed by, from the upper floors of the factory, first came insults and then came projectiles. First, it was cotton waste, which didn't really hurt anybody. It was just obnoxious. But then it was pieces of wood. And then it was pieces of steel and bolts and things that they had used in the factory. A dead cat, among other things, was thrown at them. And then they started to spray water on them from the fire hoses. Some of it was actually scalding hot. And this is all happening to people who are so crowded in the street, they can't possibly avoid it. They're just sitting ducks for it. So a couple of prominent Jews on the street went into the factory to try to get the management to stop this, but they weren't understood. A lot of them were speaking Yiddish. They were actually ejected with water as well. At which point, the only thing that the Jews could do, they saw that they could do, is take the projectiles that had been thrown at them and throw them back up at the factory. And in the process, they broke every single window in that factory that was on the two facades of the intersection.
So wait,
Mr.
where are
Ho,
the police? We're waiting to hear where the police are.
well, there were a few police who had been detailed to escort the procession, and they were unequal to the task of bringing any order to this. So Robert Ho, the owner of the factory, called the police and asked for reinforcements. And several hundred police officers from various precincts came by wagon to the site. And by the time they got there, the violence had more or less subsided. I mean, a lot of people were bleeding in the gutter, whether they were men who had projectiles thrown on them, or or women and children who'd been trampled, because that's the only way you could get away, was to run. When the police arrived, they were under the command of an inspector named Adam Cross, who was of Dutch descent, and he really didn't make any effort to distinguish the aggressors from the victims. He had a little tete-a-tete with Robert Ho, and then he simply told his police officers, and this is a direct quote, to club the life out of them. At which point the police officers picked up their billy clubs and they started beating the Jews. And by the time it was over, there were several hundred people who had been injured. Fortunately, nobody died. There were a few people who were taken to the hospital that nobody thought were going to live, but as a practical matter, nobody actually died in this. The newspapers were very sympathetic to the Jews, the English language papers. The Forwitz, the socialist of Daily Forward, actually called it a pogrom, a bloody pogrom. And they used that term, even though, as I say, it probably didn't compare to pogroms in Europe because nobody had died and it wasn't really premeditated. It just sort of happened. And some Jews were taken to the hospital, some were treated on site, and some were arrested. And the ones who were arrested went to the Essex Market Police Court in front of a judge to be arraigned. And have I gone on far enough, or should I just keep going? You want to...
Phyllis?
Well, what was the reaction? So this was covered in the newspapers.
Oh, yes.
What's the reaction of the general population in New York when they hear about this?
Very sympathetic, and I'll tell you why.
Sympathetic to whom? To whom?
To the Jews. It was no secret that the New York police were highly corrupt and highly arbitrary in the way they delivered justice. And it wasn't just the Jews who were at the other end of their batons. Anytime there was a gathering of people outside that they didn't like, they would just start beating people. That was one thing that was violent. They were also highly corrupt. There were lots of cases, for example, where the Jewish merchants who were selling from push carts on the street would be essentially shaken down by the police. They would have to give the police a certain amount of squeeze, a certain amount of money in order to be allowed to stay on the street. And this was whether they had permits or not. There had also been some previous interactions between the Jews and the police that were not very pretty. There was one that I found, I think it was the late 1880s or early 1890s, where the Jews had been on it was a strike. It was a strike against the factory. And it was a textile factory, so most of the employees were Jews. And they were on the street demonstrating. They had a permit, but the police came and just started beating heads. And so the Jews took it, they lodged a formal complaint to the police department, and they were given a hearing by an inspector who actually said, and this is a direct quote, "I would never believe a Jew under oath. You may as well go home." So they were accustomed to not getting justice when something like this happened. It was an exception if a police officer could possibly be disciplined for something that he did to a Jewish person, or to a black person or to other people. Sorry?
So
Evelyn?
how would you explain the behavior of the police on that day
Well, on that
during the
day, they
funeral?
were acting under orders from Inspector Cross, who had no love for Jews. He was very corrupt. He was taking money from brothels in order to let them stay open. And at one point, he was investigated by a group of religious leaders, among them a couple of senior members of the Jewish community. And at one point, he was actually fired from the force, but he managed to sue them and come back in. So he was very dangerous for the Jews. He didn't like Jews. And
Okay.
most of the police force also was Irish. He was not, but most of them were. And the Irish, I mean, it's well documented that the Irish kind of looked down on the Jewish immigrants, just as they had been looked down on by the Protestants when they showed up. And there was somebody lower on the totem pole that they could make trouble for.
Yeah.
Um,
And Scott, what had been the attitude in New York City towards Jews up until that date, just in general?
Well, there was anti-Semitism, of course. There were actually sort of two different variants, I guess you might say, or species of anti-Semitism. There was the anti-Semitism of the wealthy, who had accepted the earlier Jewish arrivals, the German Jews and the Sephardic Jews. They had a certain amount of acceptance in Gentile society. But by the 1880s, the social anti-Semitism against them had started. It was more like, we don't want these people in our clubs. We don't want them staying in our hotels. They're they're low class, etc. Even though these people were really in a very, very different situation from the Russian and Eastern European immigrants on the Lower East Side. But I think what you're really asking is what was going on for them. And there was anti-Semitism among the other immigrant groups. The Jews were the Johnny-come-latelys. Most of them spoke an odd language, being basically Yiddish. Many of them didn't seem at all interested in assimilating. And of course, that was, what you did when you came to America. You assimilated. Because a lot of these people just wanted to be left alone to live their lives, the same lives they'd lived in their shtetls, but perhaps slightly better because they were in a country that wasn't where they had more opportunity. And the Jews were coming in very large numbers, and they had displaced some of the Irish in the housing on the Lower East Side. There were a lot of reasons to dislike them, but not the same reasons really that the Uptown Jews were experiencing, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And what did the Jewish community do to seek justice?
Well, before the day was out, several professional Jews came together, doctors, lawyers, at one person's house, and they agreed that they were going to form an organization that was going to seek justice for the victims, which they did. What was different about 1902 from what had been happening before was that with the large numbers of Jews who were coming into New York and staying, they had managed to acquire some political clout that they hadn't had before. You had to be in America for 5 years before you could be a citizen and you could vote. But a lot of the Jews registered as soon as they were able to. And actually the Tammany Hall machine, which wanted to continue to get votes and give out favors and stuff, they actually encouraged this. So they got more and more Jewish voters were on the rolls in New York City. And in 1901, at the very end of 1901, right before this happened, Tammany Hall was put out by the election, and a reformer named Seth Low he won the mayor's race. Seth Low was, I think he was a New Englander, but he had been the mayor of Brooklyn, and he had been the president of Columbia University before he became the mayor of New York. And he was a Philo-Semite. He had always been good to the Jews. When he was in Brooklyn, he would go to the openings of the YMHAs and make contributions to Jewish charities. At Columbia, he made sure that they didn't give exams on the high holy days so the Jewish kids wouldn't have problems with it. He really was a favorite of the Jewish community. And although Tammany Hall had some support among the Jews because they were good at giving out jobs and things like that, Seth Low won the mayoralty by about 30,000 votes, and everybody knew that the Jews had put him over. because most of the Jews did vote for him. They knew it, and he knew it. And so when they set up this organization to try to get justice, the first phone call was to the mayor, and they got him on the phone. And they told him what they were going to do, and he said, I will support you. The very next day, he sent a note to the new chief of police that he had appointed. One of his campaign, one of the elements of his platform was to clean up the corrupt police department, which Tammany Hall was responsible for. So he put this man in to clean up the department. And then one of the first memos he got in the middle of the year from the mayor was, I want to investigate, I want a report, I want a full report about what happened. Well, perhaps using the worst judgment possible, the police chief asked none other than Adam Cross to write the report. Now, by this time, Inspector Cross and Robert Hoe, the chairman of the company, had both issued statements to the press that blamed the whole thing on the Jews, and they said that the Jews had come prepared to cause trouble. Yeah, prepared to cause trouble. And they even had a theory that all of the projectiles that the Jews threw at the factory had not been at the factory before. They said there were no stones on that street beforehand. The Jews brought them. And then they were planning on doing this. And it was preposterous. These were people who were mourning their chief rabbi. They weren't coming to make trouble. All they wanted to do was pay their respects to this man. But they knew, these gentlemen who got together, they knew that if they didn't do something, they were going to get blamed. The Jews were going to get blamed for it because it was very clear that it was already happening. One of the most interesting things about this group of people who got together was that, unlike there was never any real love lost between the uptown Jews and the downtown Jews at this point. The German Jews and to a lesser extent the Sephardim had achieved a certain amount of recognition and acceptance by the Gentile establishment. And with these large numbers of, you'll pardon me, unwashed Russian Jews, and my grandfather was one of them, so it's okay if I say that, I guess, they were very embarrassed by these people. They didn't seem to want to assimilate. They continued to speak Yiddish. And what the Germans were worried about was that they were going to interfere with their tentative acceptance that they had gotten. For the Russian point of view, they went uptown and looked at the Reformed synagogues and thought they were in a church. No men and women sitting together, organs, no kippot, no shaitels on the heads of the women. So they didn't really like each other very much, but they recognized the mutual responsibility. And that's why the German Jews would set up settlement houses in the Lower East Side in order to Americanize these unwashed brethren that came in as fast as they could to make them more acceptable to Americans. But what was interesting was that the makeup of this group that got together, I was able to trace who they were, and I went back to the census records to find out where their grandparents had come from. They were Germans and Russians. They were uptowners and downtowners. They were Reform Jews and they were Orthodox Jews. Everybody came together because the Jewish community had been attacked. It was not a time for division. It was a time to unite.
And what did they do?
Well, the first thing that they did was they got lawyers to defend these people in court, the ones who'd been arrested. That was not a very pretty picture. A lot of the judges didn't even let them testify. He just fined them. $5 fine, $10 fine, whatever it was. Now, the $10 fine, by the way, was a week's pay for a breadwinner. But what they did, the first thing they did was they called the mayor and they asked for the investigation. And the mayor instructed the police department to do an internal investigation. And it became very clear very quickly that the police were really not in a position to investigate themselves. They were not going to get a true hearing from the police. And so when the police started doing it, and the Jews realized that they weren't taking it seriously and they weren't going to get a decent verdict out of them, they went back to the mayor and said, we need a civilian group. And the mayor appointed, I think it was 5 or 6 people, I think it may have been 6, 2 of whom were Jews. And as far as we know, it was the first civilian group in the United States to investigate an ethnic riot. And they listened to testimony. And actually, it was the Jewish groups that were teeing up these witnesses. They did the interviewing first. They knew who said, the guy hit me here, he hit me there, that sort of thing. So they were feeding them witnesses that they could listen to. But interestingly enough, the mayor, he didn't simply limit the authority of this committee to look at the riot on July 30th. He said that if they had other issues with the police, this was the time to raise them. And it was as if they had been storing these things up for years and finally had an opportunity to testify against the police without fear of reprisal. And so the first group of witnesses, they weren't even talking about the riot. They were talking about getting beaten up by the police on the street for no particular reason, or what they were doing to the push carts and all of this sort of thing. So eventually they got together a report, a blistering report, that not only exonerated the Jews, but also indicted the police, and interestingly enough, also indicted the judges. They said in this report that the judges were not always fair to the Jews, and in dismissing the concerns of the Jews, they actually were empowering the police to be even more arbitrary about the way they handled the Jews. And so they got this report, which exonerated them, which is what they wanted. They were less successful in getting justice. I mean, things did happen. The district attorney did indict some Ho employees and a couple of police officers, but those cases didn't go very far. So those folks weren't punished. But there were resignations from the police department by officers who had the ability to retire, and they wanted to get out before the investigations because otherwise they might be punished. There were transfers within the police department. Anybody who was prominently a Jew beater was taken the hell out of the Lower East Side and sent someplace else. The chief of police, the one that was supposed to do the investigation, he was basically forced out. He officially resigned, but everybody knew he didn't have the confidence of the mayor anymore. And his deputy, whom the Jews hated for other reasons, also got pushed out. So there were personnel changes as a result of it. And as far as the Jews were concerned, they didn't get everything they wanted, but it really was the first time they were ever taken seriously, and that anybody listened to their complaints and actually tried to do something about it. And that's, I think, what the lesson of this thing was that this really was among the first times that they had political power, they knew it, they used it deftly in order to get some form of justice, and they were somewhat successful at it.
The thing that Evelyn and I are very interested in from this account is how the Jewish different groups work together. And could we now bring this up to 2025? And what lessons can we learn from all the disparate groups and on a whole continuum of opinions here in the United States and around the world who have all these different opinions? How can we get them to work together for the defense of the Jewish people?
I would say that the 1902 events of 1902 are silent on any cooperation between the Jewish groups and anybody else. This was This game was the Jewish community, and
right now that's what we're interested in. We're interested in the Jewish community now coming together.
Yes, I understand that. I think that well, a little bit further on from this, after this was over, just a few years after this was over, there was a new police chief. He made some comments. Actually, he wrote an article in which he blamed a very large percentage of the crime in New York City on the Jews. It wasn't true. His statistics were crazy. And eventually, at that point, the mayor was back, Tammany Hall was back in power. And the Jewish community decided that they didn't need his head on a platter. What they wanted was a retraction, and they got one from him. Shortly after that, the Jewish community concluded that if they set up an ad hoc group each time they had a problem like this, it was not the best way to proceed. A few months before this happened, there was another thing that I've written a book about. I called it The Great Kosher Meat War of 1902, where Jewish women took to the streets because the price of kosher meat went too high and they couldn't afford it. And they set up a group to essentially manage this crisis. The next year, there were rent strikes on the Lower East Side. They set up another ad hoc group to do it. But these groups never survived beyond the problem. And after this incident with the police captain, police superintendent, excuse me, they decided they needed a permanent group that was going to last, that would be ready for the next problem. And they set up something called the New York Kehillah, which was supposed to be an umbrella group for all of the Jewish organizations. It didn't, unfortunately, last very long, a dozen years or so, and it was gone. There were, internal divisions. You were asking a lot of people that didn't normally talk to each other to cooperate with each other. It didn't really work. But the other thing that happened in the wake of this was that the Anti-Defamation League was established a decade or so later, and the American Jewish Congress was established, and the American Jewish Committee was established. Those were national level organizations, and they've been with us since then. They didn't sunset, they didn't fall apart. They have been essentially the standard bearers for whatever was going on with the Jewish community. And
you mentioned something that really struck me. You said in 1902, and the reaction of the Jewish community to that riot, it united the Jewish community in standing up against what happened. But there were no allies outside the Jewish community, you said.
I didn't see much evidence. Well, except that the newspapers were sympathetic.
Except the newspapers, but there were no other
writers to the newspapers were sympathetic. And I think the newspapers reflected the general feeling of the population. They may not have loved Jews, but they hated the police. And they found it very easy to believe that the police were at fault here.
Did the Jewish community seek allies?
I didn't find evidence of that in 1902.
No. Okay.
I did.
All right.
So it's not easy for me to opine about today, just because there's really nothing as far as I can recall, in that early period that would suggest how to do that. And as far as I'm concerned, the best response that people have today is to unify behind the Jewish groups, which themselves are seeking allies. I mean, the ADL doesn't work alone. When half of the time they're filing amicus briefs in court cases that they didn't launch themselves, where there are common interests that we can work with other people as well.
Yeah, but what we saw last year when there were so many anti-Semitic incidents was that the people that are in this intersectional alliance and where the Anti-Defamation League also participates in, they didn't help us, the Jewish community, to defend ourselves against the anti-Semitic wave of incidents.
I don't know about you. I get a daily email from the ADL with what's going on the campuses. They send it out. They'll send it to you if you sign up for it as well. It's a school by school. What happened on the campus, what the university president or whatever it is did, who got punished, who got let off. And in my experience, there's a lot of pressure now on these university presidents to make sure, at very least, that the Jewish kids don't feel that they're unsafe there. I mean,
that's correct. Finally, that's happening. But it's coming from the Jewish community. It's not coming from any allies.
Well, I don't know that that's for sure. That's absolutely true, but it's not something I'm following as closely as I did 1902. So I'm not your expert on that. I suspect that I'm pretty sure that it isn't simply the Jews who are behind this. Anybody who wants, I mean, look, I mean, if you're on a campus and you're demonstrating against the Israeli government's policies toward Gaza, that's your right. That's your free speech right. There's nothing that anybody should be able to do about that. But if you're making the Jewish kids on campus, without regard to how they feel about Israel, if you're making the Jewish kids on campus feel unsafe, if you're physically hurting them, anything like that, that's pure anti-Semitism. That's nothing to do with Israel. That's just anti-Semitism. It's blaming one Jew for the action or the perceived action of another Jew. And that has to be cracked down on.
Yes. And so we have experienced help. We got help from the Christian community. we last year we didn't get help from the Black community so much. We didn't get help from the gay community so much, and from other minority groups.
Yeah,
Yeah, but that
think you're right.
yeah.
And that's the kind of allyship that we would like to get.
Right. Right.
And we'd also like for Jewish groups to be on the same page rather than, I rarely use this term, so I hesitate. The far left Jewish groups who themselves can't distinguish between legitimate criticism of Israeli actions and delegitimizing Israel and all Jews.
Mhm.
So we have our own internal problems at the same time.
Yeah. Andrew Silo Carroll, I don't know if that's a name you know. He's the editor of New York Jewish Week. And he interviewed me about this book and wrote an article about it. And he said something that I found very interesting at the end of the article. He said, in the past, we have this very disparate and very opinionated group of Jews in the United States that don't agree on too much of anything. But that in the past, the one unifier, to the extent that there was a unifier, was Israel. He said it's flipped. He said the unifier now is anti-Semitism. It's not Israel, because a lot of Jews feel differently about what's going on in Israel. As we all see on the campuses, there are Jewish groups that are anti-Israeli policy. And I thought that was a very interesting statement on his part, that what it is now, that anti-Semitism is what ought to be uniting us and is uniting us, not completely, because after all, we're Jews. We disagree with each other.
Yes.
And that was the same. That was the same in 1902, as I understand. It was this anti-Semitic riot that united the Russian Lower East End Jews with the
Right. But a few
Upper
months
East
earlier,
Side German
there was
Jews.
a kosher meat strike when the women took to the streets, and it actually got violent. I mean, there were women pulling each other's hair and breaking the windows of the butcher shops. The uptown Jews most of them were pretty quiet about it. They didn't really like what they saw. And even the New York Times, which was German Jewish run, was horrified. And they were very, very critical of these women who were demonstrating in the streets because their backs were against the wall. They couldn't feed their families. They weren't going to buy unkosher meat. They didn't feel they could and still be Orthodox Jews. And they couldn't afford kosher meat. But there was not much sympathy from the New York Times for them at that point. But this one was different. People were beaten up. And I'm not suggesting that the Midtown Jews came in a huge wave to protest this. But when I looked at the backgrounds of the people who were leaders here, who got together on this committee, I was pleasantly surprised to see that actually the Sephardim weren't represented, but there weren't very many Sephardim. But the uptowners and the downtowners were there.
And that's very important.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm in the light again here. Sorry.
It's okay.
It's very important.
So, Scott, how can individuals listening to this podcast encourage the uniting of the Jewish community to confront the rise of anti-Semitism?
Well, I'll speak personally. There's an expression. The expression "the October 7th Jews" has come to the fore. People who were kind of shocked into some activism by what happened on October 7th. And to a certain extent, I guess I'm one of them. I feel that I was a little slow to appreciate the anti-Semitism on the left. I've always been worried about the anti-Semitism on the right, but the one on the left, it kind of snuck up on me. So I've doubled down on my contributions to, for example, the ADL. I want to support the organizations that kind of know how to do this. The people, groups like the ADL, they're all about education. That's the first step, is trying to educate people so you don't have this kind of anti-Semitism that foments the violence. But after that, they're activists as well. And they're encouraging that the universities take action against the students or the outsiders who foment violence against Jewish kids. And I think that's where we should be. I think that the lesson of 1902 is that we unify and we organize and we use whatever political power we have with the authorities to ensure that it's punished. And if it's punished, it's less likely to recur.
I like that very much what you said. Without talking any politics about what's happening recently,
Right.
when things are punished, they're less likely to occur again.
Right.
So we've come to the end of this very fascinating conversation. Is there anything else that you'd like to add?
I think I just said it. To tell you the truth.
I do too. So thank you, Scott, so much. We thank our listeners for listening to us. We hope that they will act on these suggestions. For those of you who want to know more about Evelyn and myself and our work, you can go to Never Again Is Now podcast on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. And please, as we end every episode, we say, speak up against anti-Semitism and all hate.